Hey guys, Jim Vanoski with Manufacturing Talks. Welcome to show 199. I've got a great host to mark my on the cusp of the milestone of 200. It's Gail Robertson. She's my Canadian friend who has helped me out in a couple of previous shows. You may remember her from the live stream with Mark Mills, I don't know, a couple of years ago now, I guess. And then the show of shows with Mike Rowe back 6, 8 months ago. She's here on her own this time. So we're going to talk about some topics we've been discussing offline for a while, things I think that are important in the manufacturing world. And Gail is here to kind of give the Canadian perspective and help knit up U.S.-Canadian relations. She'll be with us in just a minute here on Manufacturing Talks.
Welcome to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vanoski. Industry has a million cool stories, and Jim talks to the movers and shakers who are making them happen. Let's dive in.
Gail, welcome back to Manufacturing Talks. How you doing?
I am doing great. Thanks, Jim. Great to be here.
It's good to have you back. It's very exciting. We've got lots and lots to cover, and this one's going to be a different kind of show. I should mention that this is show 199. And so you're in this transition mode from one milestone to another. So thanks for that.
Love it.
So before we dig into all the cool topics that we got into offline chatting last week, why don't you tell us who you are, how you got doing what you're doing today, and what you're up to?
Okay, well, originally I started out as a journalist. That's what I went to school for, was journalism. And then I did a little detour and ran a bed and breakfast. That's just a whole other little sideline. And then I was a fundraiser at a culture and recreation complex. And then from there, through to connections I made through that fundraising role, I was hired as a manager of advertising and promotions department in an industry that was around tech and insurance. And I worked there until they sold to a larger international company. And so I left and started my own business and as Gail Now. Yep. And I've been doing that since 2018. And then now I'm more into what I call a semi-retired mode. I've decided to take time focused on cycling and traveling and appearing on podcasts like this.
Beautiful. Yeah. And you know, I mentioned before we got on together your background with me, which was I got to know you through LinkedIn and saw that you were doing stuff well beyond my capabilities at that time. You helped get me on the StreamYard platform, and then you helped me out with it for my first live stream, which was with my buddy Mark Mills, who I now work for at the National Center for Energy Analytics. And then you came on and helped again with the show of shows with Mike Rowe. So we've got a great history in this, but what I'm still actually not real clear on is I know you're very interested in the manufacturing world. What led to that?
Well, that's interesting. So when I left after I'd been in the insurance and tech world, actually through connections and networking, I actually connected up with the owner of a mold making company here in Windsor. And it was one of these things that because of my background in marketing and social media, one of the things that I realized is that you can apply marketing, those skills, to any other industry, because once you know the foundation, then you just learn about the industry. So I spent a lot of time reading magazines, reading online, watching YouTube channels, and learning about what mold making was all about.
Oh, cool.
So, and then I went to, trade shows, and luckily my mentor and now very good friend, Tim Galbraith, I want to do a shout out to him. He was so patient. I can remember sitting down, with my notepad, asking him questions, and he was extremely patient with me. And over time, I just learned about that industry, and I was blessed to be able to go out and walk the floor of a mold making shop and talk to the people there and ask them, what is this? What are you doing? What is this? And the best way to learn is just go out, ask questions, be curious, be open to learning about something new. So it was very exciting, much like when I learned about insurance. I didn't know about insurance, and I learned about how that industry works. So that's how I got into manufacturing. And then Tim very graciously nominated me to go on the board of the Canadian Association of Mold Makers. Thank
Oh,
you,
wow.
Jim. And so I was on the board with that, and then was very involved during COVID. We used to have meetings every morning at 7:30 a.m. talking about the impact of COVID on the industry and how we were going to manage things, you know, looking at the border. And so that's really when I got very, very involved. And probably that's when more of our paths crossed, because I got really involved in how we could still maintain those relationships and, you know, do work between the two countries. And then more recently, I did work as a consultant, helping with how the Canadian Association of Mold Makers has gone on now to do around skilled trades and getting more young people into it. And that was my most recent time. So I haven't been on the board for a while, but I was brought back to help the executive director with getting some of those, marketing things set up, because of my knowledge and background in the industry, as well as marketing and knowing the local landscape, and also having a lot of contacts politically, a lot of contacts still in the media. And, you know, I am someone that does question some of the current media, but I still maintain friendships with people that, you know, I'm a great believer. We can agree to disagree. Two things can be true, and that being curious, not judgmental, is the key to success in any industry, in any relationship, and just having that openness. So that's my background in how I got into manufacturing, and specifically mold making, which is also a fascinating world because it's the people who make things that make things.
Yeah, very cool. One thing I thought of while you were talking is, I think in a lot of cases, people unfamiliar with the manufacturing world get intimidated because you're talking to guys who have, first of all, this kind of stereotype of being crusty, you know, mean
Yeah.
old guys who don't like newcomers, which, you know, there's some truth to every stereotype. But what I've found and what I've seen is, it doesn't matter who you are and where you're coming from. If you're genuinely interested in what someone, you know, one of these old experts is doing, and you want to learn and put in the time, I mean, you're not going to find anyone more willing to share what they know and what they've learned and why they value it so much.
Jim, you have nailed it. And I want to bring something up. Before I got into this and I was a journalist, I have to say, I remember hearing terms like supply chain, and I did not understand it. I tried to
Yep.
understand. It just seemed like this, I don't know, things cost more because of supply chain, but I didn't really understand the levels of it.
Yep.
Then actually, when I sat on that committee at 7:30 every morning for months, we did this for quite a few months.
Oh, yeah.
So we heard from politicians, bureaucrats, people in the industry, and then we were trying to come up with, how do we maneuver through all of this? Well, I learned about supply chain real quick,
Mhm.
and how things work or don't work, or when things get stuck and freighters get stuck and you can't, what do you do when even there were issues with crossing the border, because people who went back and forth every day, they would get some sort of approval to do that. But in mold making, they didn't have to go necessarily every day. If they were going to do a check on something, they maybe only had to go every few weeks, and they would get stopped. And sometimes they couldn't cross because they weren't, it made no sense to me. For someone like me, I go like, wait a minute, the person going back every day seems to be at a higher risk if you're assuming there is a greater risk. But
Yeah.
when you say, oh, they only have to go back and forth every month, but there was some real inconsistencies, and I'm being kind, around everything that happened during that time period. And I learned so much about why we need to be curious, why we need to ask more questions, and not just assume always that people in certain positions of authority have what's best in mind for us. And we
Yeah.
need to, in questioning that, and I will tell you, as I now call myself a recovering journalist,
Mhm.
and that's not because I've been through any trauma in war. It's just, I really have concerns and issues sometimes about how media is covering things. But then you have to look at who's funding them, and none of this gets challenged anymore. So yeah, that's something I feel very strongly about. as a recovering journalist that we need to speak truth to power. We need to challenge those in authority. And, I am a nonpartisan, and I've made that a conscious decision I don't belong to any political party. And the reason is that I want to have the freedom to be able to speak freely, to question whoever is in power. Right now, people may think I'm some strong conservative, but it's only because we have liberals in power right now. And I question some of the things that are being done. And it's what I think as a journalist we should be doing. We should be asking tough questions. But I also know from my time in fundraising and my time in media is that you often can't really bite the hand that feeds you.
That's true. Now, you've mentioned the border a couple of times, and that's one of the things you and I interacted on pretty routinely, mainly via X, is what's going on in Canada, what's going on in the US. Yeah, it's kind of a tough time for relations between our two countries. What are you thinking about that, and what do you think we need to do about it?
Well, as you know, Jim, we were talking last week, and I have a lot of thoughts about this. I just got back from a trip. Well, last fall I was in Europe. I traveled because of someone I met during COVID in LinkedIn. I met a woman friend of mine from Bulgaria. I spent time in Bulgaria. I went to Istanbul and I went to Sicily. Traveling in Europe, fascinating. People, and especially with countries, Bulgaria just ended communism in 1989. So that's fascinating to talk to people. Yep. Then I just got back from just over a month. I was in Texas and Florida, and I was also on a cruise in the midst of all this. But what's really fascinating is talking to people of all stripes. I talk to people with all different political views. And I told my son once that I'm going to say it's I'm basically a Canadian ambassador. I'm down there to talk to people, listen, and
a darn good one, by the way.
Oh, thank you. One of the things that I found during this time is that there's good people and not so good people wherever you go in the world and your life. And when I was in the States, there's a lot of people that don't agree with the current government. There's people that don't agree and there's people that agree. It's sort of a mixed bag. And there's even people that maybe supported Trump also don't like some of his tactics and but what we need is more people to get curious about understanding, especially Canadians, understanding the difference between Canada and the US in terms of how the political, the landscape is set up. Very, very different. So in the US, as you know, and I'm not an expert on this, but I've certainly talked to enough people. There's a two-party system, and people often vote against one, not necessarily for one. And so as I talk to people, some people were like, oh, kind of like, I'm sorry. And then I said, listen, I talk to people based on who they are, are they good people? And I also know that, if I'm going to go to the States during good times and when things are going well, some of the businesses and people down there, if I decide not to go now, that seems to hurt the people that will be there long term. So it's kind of cherry picking then, like, oh, I'll go when I like who's in power, but not when I don't like, for example. And if we chose all of our travels in the world based on who is in charge of each country, that would be I would be very sad because I wouldn't be able to probably go places. I questioned some of, while I was in Istanbul and I just read about the president at the time had just supported Hamas. And I was like, but so what I did was I went because I'd been to mosques, I went and searched out the Jewish museum and spent time there and talked to people at the Jewish museum who were Muslim. Really interesting to see the world through that lens. When you start to talk to people and understand, where people are coming from, instead of just attacking based on ideology. And that's where, Jim, you and we've had many discussions because we can understand that let's just talk about what for you, manufacturing. I mean, I've learned so much from you about manufacturing and your knowledge of the industry and really whatever politics we may have is that's not really germane to how we're going to work together. And that leads us to the whole Canada-US relationship when it comes to manufacturing.
Mm-hmm.
And we're way off base when it comes to what's happening now in Canada, that the incessant attacks on, people who go to the States, or just this name calling to Trump. I just think it's really does a disservice to things like manufacturing, because we need each other. And
Yep.
one of the stats that came up recently in my research that I can't believe this has not been kind of promoted more widely, is that 70% of Canadian exports to the US are intermediates for production rather than final consumer products. So we're not really in a position, like the US needs some of our resources, our oil and all of our minerals. So why can't we just step back and say, ignore some of the rhetoric and look at that, right? And try to have those dialogues and talk to Americans. Why would we not go to the US and talk to people and build relationships with a country that we're close to, a country that has similar culture, and like we have more in common than not in common.
Yep.
So it boggles my mind right now why we're in this position of just constant attacking of, not wanting to go and, oh, how dare you go to the US and talk to Americans?
Yeah, it's not, these things and
Yes.
social media tend to elevate the views of the minority, the more extreme views. And to your point, when you get out among normal, everyday Canadians or Americans, you don't find that level of hostility, at least not in normal places. I was in Toronto a few months ago, and never came up. People knew I was an American, and my hosts were as gracious as they could possibly be. I'm sure they have different politics than I do, and it didn't come up. We talked about issues in manufacturing and supply chain on the show I was on, and I'm sure they didn't agree with everything I said, but I'm there as a guest, and they treated me with kindness and respect, and that's a piece of what we should all be doing, both in personal interactions and on the screens. Unfortunately, on the screens, it seems to kind of everyone have their freak flag fly and gets a little crazy.
I'm a big proponent of social media with an asterisk next to that.
Yeah,
is that we need to have more education in schools about how social media works, how the algorithm works. Now, I know how the algorithm works, so I purposely go listen to a wide range of views. I'm aware of the extremes on each side. And, even if you're talking about something as simple as CNN and Fox, like it's not one that I think if you're only listening to one view, and I can tell you when I was in the States, I do know people that listen to, CNN, CBC, and these YouTube channels where I know after listening to some of them, I believe they're like AI generated, because it's this weird voice and it's these commentary that's just, it is like, and I can't even believe I'm saying something like this, but it's almost like a mind control thing that is very worrisome to someone like myself. Because I'm like, if you're only listening to that over and over again, and if you know anything about how that works, I mean, historically, what people have done to just like, get people to, abide by certain ways of doing things, right? And it's usually in countries that are dictatorships, right? It's just there's only one media source. And now I think why there is such an uprising against someone like a Joe Rogan is that, and I say this, the uprising is mostly by people who have not listened to his show.
Yeah.
And
or if they did, they listened to one show.
Yeah. And part of it. I can always tell sometimes when people are shocked sometimes that I listen to Joe Rogan, and I'm actually, I would consider myself a fan of his, because I've listened to probably 50 of his shows at a minimum. They're about 3 hours each. So
I was just going to say, that's a pretty fair time commitment.
It is. And I sort of went back and looked at how many. I sometimes don't listen to all, like usually I'll listen, and then if they start to go down the MMA route or whatever, I fast forward. I mean, it's fascinating sometimes, but don't list all of it. But
Yeah, not your
here's
cup of
why,
tea.
and I have a list of everybody he's on it. I've listened to Ken Burns. I've listened to Bernie Sanders. He's had on another guy, I can't think of his name, but he's talked about the Amazon. I would challenge anyone to, if you're thinking Joe Rogan is some right wing, mega, whatever you want to call him, he's not. He's actually more of an old school Democrat who
Yeah, I agree.
really is quite social on many issues. He really supports. I've heard him challenge people when it comes to like gay lesbian issue. He's like on the side of like, listen, people have a right to love who they love. And so that's just one of many topics. And usually the attacks I've seen on him are when they cherry pick a comment, right? So yeah, I think people need to, if you're going to challenge or attack someone, go spend time listening first, do your research. The reason I got into Joe Rogan was that I thought he was this knuckle dragging Neanderthal. So everybody talked about him, and I thought, I better go check out this guy, right? Because I think my son I watched part of his comedy, and I was like, so I liked some of it. Some of it was like, eh. And then I started listening, and I went, oh, wow, this guy is a great interviewer. They're long form interviews. So it's usually I listen to it when I'm on road trips or I'm doing cleaning or cooking. I have it on in the background and listen, and it's really quite fascinating. So, and that leads, I know you're doing around storytelling, which I think is also really important.
And let's definitely dive into that. One thing I'll say though, to your point about listening to the arguments of people you disagree with, I long ago heard the advice that the best way to counter someone's argument is to be able to make it well yourself. So learn what their premises are, learn the logic that gets them to the point where they're diametrically opposed to you. If you can articulate that, you're in no better place than to then tear it down if you disagree and think that the logic leads to a different conclusion or they've started from false premises. But attacking someone from the get-go, just saying you're wrong and, casting shade and all that stuff just leads to the kind of polarization we're talking about.
And that's where now is that most of it's very emotionally based, where it's just like calling him the orange man or the devil or you name it. I mean, when it comes to Trump, and to your point of understanding two views, when I was in high school, I was on the debating team.
Oh, yeah.
And we had to prepare both sides of an argument.
Yep.
And you didn't know until you got to the next school when you had to show up. They would then tell you which side you were arguing for. Right. So you had to be ready. And I tell you, that to me has been the best part of my learning and my role as a journalist is you have to really dig in and not just look. I mean, it's easier to go look. If you don't agree with someone, you can go find reasons why you don't like them, why you're going to disagree with them. But if you have to go in and find reasons to listen to him. And so right now with our current prime minister, I have a lot of concerns and questions because my role is to speak truth to power and challenge him. But I also I could say some positive things about him, and I can, because I think his intention on doing some things, even when it comes to maybe even around manufacturing and, getting oil out of the ground and things, he's made some outreaches to Daniel Smith, who's the premier of Alberta. Yep. And I think his intentions have been good. He's said some of the right things. Here's the problem, though. He's faced with a caucus he's being pushed and pulled in a few directions. And sadly, right now, I think he is so concerned about if there was an election call that he might lose or he'd lose people. So what he's doing is he's going along with so now he's pulling back on some of these things. And this does not bode well for manufacturing or for people wanting to invest in Canada, because if you don't feel there is a solid ground or a solid foundation or, they came up with this MOU in Alberta and like about getting, pipelines and such, but the MOU, which basically it's a paper agreement. It's not a contract. It's this agreement that they'll do things. But a lot of investors right now are still going, like everything seemed to be going well until he pulled back and he moved Stephen Guilbeault. Guilbeault is a very radical person in his caucus. So he moved him out of the environmental portfolio, but he's still in caucus. My my concern right now is that do we have a government that is committed to improving on what is happening in Canada, on our getting, negotiations back on track with the US, or do we have a government that wants to win at all costs?
Mhm.
And when I say win at all costs, win your own, like grow your party. And, I don't want to get too far off track here, but there's been a couple of floor crossers. But this is where I wish the media asked more questions, because the one floor crosser, he's more right leaning. Like, he's not what they call here in Canada red Tory. He's not like this left leaning. I mean, he's pro life. There's media. Normally, they're all over that when it comes to things like, choice and life and abortion rights and nothing. And so I just wish there was more questions asked about why did these couple of floor crossers, what is going on here? Because right now, Carney is doing everything possible to get a majority government without having an
Mhm.
election. So, yeah, we got a lot of stuff happening up here that is, very, as much as we like to think there's lots of problems in the US, believe me, Canadian politics right now is, it's a hotbed of some controversy too. But we need more media asking questions and doing more deep dives into asking why.
Yeah.
I'm a big
Well,
believer, why is needed to be asked more often.
yep. And there are particular issues that I think are afflicting Canada worse than maybe some other places. But I look at the broad picture you're painting, and really it's a crisis across the whole Western world,
Yes.
where we become so polarized. And to me, we've got a whole bunch of people who are very influential, who either are those bad actors, like you mentioned earlier, who truly will do just about anything for power,
Yep.
or they're just so wedded to an ideology, they can't step back and look at, geez, we've got history in doing exactly what you have said. How has that panned out? I think about energy policy itself, and you mentioned the difficulties out in Alberta and some of the fights with that. But I look at Germany and the UK, where they've chased this net zero fantasy, and it's deindustrialization and consumers unable to pay their electric bills because they've skyrocketed so dramatically. Once you've seen that happen, you don't necessarily have to say, okay, net zero is completely out the window, we're just abandoning it. But I think you have to say what we're doing right now isn't working, and yet you don't see that happening with the people in power over there. I follow a woman named Catherine Porter in the UK, and she's, I mean, literally about every minute responding to some nonsense from someone touting net zero and clean energy and all this stuff. And she's like, just constantly saying, look at your electric bill, look at what's
Right.
happening with our industry. And, it's almost like shouting into the wind for her, because she's absolutely spot on. Everything she says is documented in reality, and yet she's struggling to get through over there. She can always come over to America and help us, because I think we dodged a bullet with the last election when it comes to energy.
Yeah.
And I just wish we could take that step back, regardless of whose policy it was. I've been involved in the shipbuilding world, and there's plenty of mud to go around for everybody who's been involved in the policies there, because very little of what we've done in this very government directed and government intervened world of shipbuilding that has actually worked. And so there, should be more looking at history, learning from history, and crafting policies that just might work a little better than what we've done in the past. And unfortunately, I don't see that happening in a lot of places.
You nailed it too, with just looking at history, digging deep, asking questions, keeping an open mind. The other thing that we often hear, and, I'm someone probably historically, like I said, I was nonpartisan, but in terms of my politics, I probably would have leaned more left over many years. And I still think in many ways, the things I adhere to would be considered those progressive things that I, support. But, I feel everything else has shifted. Not so much that I have shifted, but everything else has shifted
Oh
politically.
yeah.
And one of the things we often hear is about, corporate taxes. We got to get the corporations to pay more money. And so things get thrown out. It's like, the net zero, things get thrown out and people just accept it as a given, right? That this is what you do. So it's like corporations, people with money, the rich, tax the rich, right? What's interesting in Canada back during, and this was a Liberal Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, there's a chart you can go see that where corporate taxes, he dropped the corporate taxes down, and actually they were bringing in more money from corporations because they were so successful. They were investing in Canada, and they were following what was happening in Ireland, which apparently Ireland has been doing this, right?
Yep.
I wish that I didn't have to go digging. You're right, like that should be a known fact and stat. And this is coming from a commentator. I just listened to a podcast that would be more on the conservative side, but he's actually coming across as pretty reasonable. Anybody that's interested in understanding a bit more about what's happening in Canadian politics, it's called Full Comment with Brian Lilly. Really interesting guy. He's often has different people with different viewpoints on. Back in the day, and probably some of my media counterparts say, oh, he's just a conservative, blah, blah, blah. But I started listening to him and going, oh, he's actually quite broad-minded in his views. So that's something I think we need to look at too. Instead of just throwing these things out and accepting them as fact, start digging around and asking questions, say, what do we really need? And, because and there's lots of stats talking about how we're losing, entrepreneurs and people are leaving, and, places that are lowering corporate tax rates. Well, corporations are going to go where it's most financially feasible. And this is something, because my background too, I've been involved. I was a union leader at one point too. So, and the reason I got in trouble with the union at the time was, again, speaking truth to power, I challenged some of the things in the union that were not from a right perspective, from a left perspective, that things like challenging for a secret ballot, because they wanted this vote where you had to go up to the microphone and vote, and I challenged it. So I like to think I have a pretty good background of, seeing how unions work, how corporations work. I was a manager in, a large company. So it's really about, digging deeper and seeing that broader perspective, and not just jumping on bandwagons and saying, corporations bad, rich people bad. We need to really understand how things work. And, as a journalist, when I went to journalism school, I couldn't have graduated if I didn't pass my shorthand and typing. It was a half credit course. They told you don't get your degree if you don't finish this course. But I never had to take a stats course, never had to take an economics course or a history course.
Yeah.
And there's no media body that governs what we do.
Yep.
So I think, as someone, I've since really challenged myself on understanding better things like economics and history. And I think that if you're going to be a journalist, you should, and work in anything, you should have to go take like stats. Like there's certain things you should have to go get, like stats for sure. You should really understand stats. That was a challenge for me. And I mean, it's a joke among media too, like, oh, I know nothing about math. That's why I got into journalism.
Yeah. Then you fall for anyone's story.
Yeah.
And speaking of stories, I know that's something that you're a huge believer in. And as we look at ways to get through to people better, I know storytelling is one you've mentioned here. So talk a little bit more about that.
Well, as you know, when we talked last week, I'm really excited about your book that's coming out. I think
Thank you.
We're going to talk more about that, because one of the things you do really well that I think will resonate with people is the power of storytelling, because you can rhyme off stats and data, but until we can see it in the form of a story and personalize it, which as a recovering journalist, one of the things we used to do is, when I'd write a story, is that you always wanted to talk to a person, because there would be a news came out and they'd say whatever, some stat about something. Well, now you have to go find people to make it more real, so people understand. Okay, even when a budget came out, they still do, like, how does this impact this family? How does this impact a company? So stories are extremely important. I mean, we look at people that look at Netflix, look at all the programs, Crave, Prime. I mean, there's all these shows. It's all about storytelling, right? And people will sit and watch some of these. I often laugh when people say like, oh, I don't have time to do fill in the blank, right? But they just binge watched, 50 hours of some show. So I
Yeah.
go, yeah, you do have time. We make time for whatever is important, right? And I,
Well, and it's like you say, it's what's going to draw people in and get them interested. I
yes.
know from my own personal experience, the basis of my book was stories. So I had the opportunity to write for Forbes for 7 years, write about manufacturing, which I've spent a whole career in. And yet, as I start casting the net wide for stories, I'm getting into areas of the manufacturing world that, yeah, I knew about them, but I never personally experienced them because one person in manufacturing gets to experience a tiny little sliver of it. And so now I'm writing about the stories of all these different people doing all these different things. And it's just so fascinating what's going on out there. And, you talk about Canada America relations. My chapter number one is Zamboni, which, you know, if you know what they are, you could kind of bet on it starting in either country. It actually started in America, of all places in LA,
Ah,
and um, now has a location that does a lot of their business up in Brantford, Ontario. So
ah,
um, the kinds of stories around even a well-known product like that, no one much has heard that Frank Zamboni, back after after World War II ended, got frustrated with having to manually resurface his ice rink down in one of the suburbs of LA, and went and got surplus Jeeps and started tinkering with how to automate that. And next thing you know, he's got the ice resurfacing machine that we all know as the Zamboni now, which they don't like, by the way. It's the Zamboni ice resurfacer, so they protect their brand. But yeah, it's something like that, which
ah.
everyone knows about, but no one knows the backstory, all the way down to a company like Bevan Bells up in Connecticut, where it's this company that's been around since the Civil War making bells. And you never heard the name, but the bell that rang to give the angel Clarence his wings on It's a Wonderful Life was from Bevan. And the cowbell that the guy on the cowbell skit was banging around,
And a
that
hockey
was
game.
made by Bevan Brothers. So just all kinds of extremely
Wow.
cool stories that 22 chapters, each one covering a manufacturer and their story like that. And the whole purpose of it is to show, number one, that people who think we don't make anything anymore couldn't be more wrong. We've still, America's still the number 2 manufacturer in the world. And if we would just focus minds a little bit around what we need to do for national defense alone, I submit that we would be right back in number 1. But then the other piece is to get there, to reindustrialize and to get some of those jobs back that we, in my view, foolishly squandered. There's all these companies out there doing it, and
Yeah.
you got a lot to learn from new methods and new technologies and all that. But look first at the people who've succeeded despite all the headwinds and roadblocks that we've put in their way. Some of these companies I write about, like I said, Bevan's been around since the Civil War. I've got a number of other companies that are multi-generation family companies. I've got a new company, 3D Systems, that invented a whole new way of making stuff. So just using those stories to say this can absolutely be done in America and in Canada, and we just
Right.
need to rethink what we're doing to bring some of that back.
And working together. I think,
Oh, for
I mean, I
sure.
love those stories. The Zamboni story right away. I know people don't
Yeah.
want to read that from the hockey perspective because we've got a big hockey community up here. And just those little teasers you gave already, like you piqued my curiosity because I love reading backstories. I love reading
Mhm.
like how things come about. Why is this, important? And obviously something like the Zamboni. And I didn't know that whole LA Brantford. I mean,
Yeah.
right away, there's that connection. And when we have a lot of people right now that are saying, buy Canadian, stay in Canada and all that. And I like, listen, I like to support Canadian as well, but there's things that are done in the US that, like, so a Zamboni, should we not use Zamboni because, like, is it US or Canada? It's both, right? It's
Yep.
and this is where I think these stories, like you said, there's twofold. One is definitely the Canada US relations, but also understanding the importance of manufacturing. And as I said, like, even with mold making, what I came to realize is that mold making is, like, I didn't know we're in the hotbed of mold making right in this area, and it's
Yep.
because of our proximity to the border. So
Right.
there was lots of work. I used to go to conventions in the US and talk about, so people come up here to work with mold making shops. So I'm really puzzled by this kind of, like I said, this anti-US because of only what one person, okay, you could argue more people, but yeah, there's just there's people need to broaden their minds, be more curious. That I think is what you bring to the table, Jim. And when you were on my show, Curious Minds podcast, the reason I asked you on is that you're someone that looks at things through that curiosity lens, and it really can change how you see so many things in life. I mean, with friendships, relationships, workplaces, your government. If you get curious and ask, tell me more. Tell me more about that. Or say, we often we jump to these conclusions and judge without understanding the backstory. So
Right.
I think your book telling this backstory about manufacturing is going to be really important to the industry and for politicians. And, I would say you better get that maybe slide across the table of Trump and Vance and whoever else, because I think it's important that they see that and understand that there is so much potential. Circle that Zamboni story.
Yeah. Well, to me, and I know I'm biased, I've spent my whole career in manufacturing, so it's something that is a draw for me personally, no matter what. But as I got going in some of these things, and I'd written about a number of these companies for Forbes, and so some of it's just I'd get a pitch from a company, or I'd come across some news about a company and find them interesting and go off and write about them. But as I wrote the book, I also tried to relate why these stories were so appealing to me personally. So it's everything from, like, I had this little red Farmall tractor when I was a little boy. It showed up in like every picture from when I was, I don't know, 3 till 7. And I got wondering, okay, who made those, and are they still around? And tracked this whole story about how what was Farmall back in, I don't know, the turn of the last century, is now Case New Holland. And
Wow.
and so, yeah, tracking that. There's a couple of different stories about companies in the bicycling industry. I'm a lifelong bicyclist. I
Me
know
too.
you too, so you'll like those. And just tying those to my own personal interest and including that in the stories as well.
I think it's important that we do look at, what is important in our past that's important to us, because it's likely going to be important to someone else. And
Absolutely.
and
Yep.
the more we can connect the dots, I'm a great believer connecting dots to things. And learning about, I mean, I'm a lifelong learner. I got into cycling. I started out, and I tell people, now I do these longer rides. My maximum is 200-kilometer ride. But I didn't start there. I started doing, 10, 15 kilometers and 20. I mean, I doing a 20-kilometer and being exhausted. Right. So, but over time and then also my network expanded. And I learned about cycling. And then I find it fascinating to always keep on top of, topics of the day, and, but also get away from my phone and
Mhm.
online, because it can really it's not healthy. And that's where you need
Yep.
to go out and do what you did. You go out and you talk to people and you research these things. And tell the stories, because this is where emotion is important. We need to tell those emotional stories to backed up with facts, as opposed to just jumping only to emotional, right? We need both. We need to use the stats and the data, and also question, why is that? Why did this company succeed? Why did this company not succeed? I wonder, do you get into that as to any companies that you thought were doing well, but then they've stumbled, or they've had problems, or they've thrived maybe?
So it's very interesting you mentioned that. I was kind of torn. Now, all the companies that are in my book still exist. Some of them have been through some extremely rough times, and that became part of the story. There's one of them in upstate New York called Revere Copper, which that name comes from Paul Revere. He started the company.
Oh, wow.
And they have been around continuously since his days. Now, they've been through a number of changes, obviously, over 250 years. And at one point, not too long ago, because of offshoring, because of the rise of China and the difficulties where they are, upstate New York, not being especially conducive to manufacturing anymore, they really were up against the wall. And so I tell that part of the story. They essentially got to a burn the furniture state, and they were able to work through it. Now, of course, copper is back in vogue because we need it for all the electrification. So they're back kind of rocking and rolling. But yeah, a number of the companies have had tough times. I debated including a couple of companies that I just love their stories, but they're long gone. One is a company that I learned about when I lived in Buffalo, New York, and it's called Larkin Soap. And it was just this group of go-getter executives who, I mean, they came up from nothing back in the 1800s and started this company in Buffalo. And it was a powerhouse in its day. They essentially started mail order and almost started something of the multi-level marketing. They had kind of these representatives who would get these promotions for the stuff they were able to sell. Really interesting story. They had a headquarters that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright that itself is also gone, sadly. Just a hugely powerful story, but the market turned against them. The rise of department stores and people shopping in person versus mailing on or ordering online and getting things through the mail. And they finally went out of business in the 1930s. And
So
they're long gone.
Online, or they sold things, how did they sell their soap?
Through the mail.
Through the mail.
Yeah, so that's for people too young,
yeah.
they think the only mail order has always been online. You and I both in the old days had to fill out the manual order form and put it in the mail and
block letters
and then wait a month for your stuff to show.
Yes, and we did. Right. That's a fascinating also story, because it went from mail order to in person, and then we went from like the in person, I think, a blockbuster.
Yeah, right.
It's like
complete flip back.
And if you don't, this is also interesting about businesses, and I've run my own business, a couple of businesses. I've been working for other people. The importance of always looking at that's where it's important to keep that open mind and be open to new ideas and listening to other perspectives, because sometimes you can get so dug into your own way of looking at things. And, one of the things, I'll give a shout out to my son. I think I've learned more. My son is now 24. Well, maybe 24 this year. I have to think now, 2002 baby. But the amount of times I've learned from him, because I listen, and it's really powerful when you can see another perspective and, even some of his views. But we've had so many great discussions lately, because he's very much, he's into the environment. He's now a vegan, but you know what? I'm not a big meat eater. It's not from some philosophical thing. I just not a big fan of meat so much. So I find in my home now, like, I'll pick up tofu. I try to make some more things that are actually vegan, but I always said I can't give up yogurt or cheese or milk or certain things. Right. But I have started drinking more of the oat milk and some of the coconut milk, things like that. So it's about being open and moving towards seeing another view. And it's healthier for me. I actually find it's good. So sometimes that's where, if you're going to grow, you don't grow when you stick to your guns and dig your heels in and you say, I'm not going to see another view. And, I have a wide range of people in my circle, right? My media friends, my cycling friends, my political friends. And I don't agree with everything. I'm sure they don't agree with everything me, but I find that I try to walk this fine line of just saying, sometimes you don't have to agree with everything. I will say this, we probably need more of, you can disagree without being disagreeable.
Definitely.
I wish there was more of that. Sometimes people get a little, I find, especially on certain platforms, they get a little nasty without, and I just go, I wish people that had no place for hate believed that about people they don't agree with. Because sometimes I see this no place for hate, and it's like,
yeah, when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, I just had a gutful of that.
Yeah.
People proclaiming against hate, yet clearly hating to an extreme people who disagreed with them. So I had General Mills colleague that I'd worked with years ago on my show specifically just to say, Mike, you are diametrically opposed. We've had knockdown dragouts on LinkedIn about political issues. Come on my show and talk about your side of the story, and I'll talk about mine. And we didn't debate. I know he and I completely disagreed on much of what we discussed, but it's just about, this is a smart guy who comes at things from a different place than I do and comes to different conclusions. And I would hate for a lot of his policies to go into effect, but he's still a good person, smart, accomplished individual who I worked with years ago. And just to show that, you can have a chat and you can disagree, and it's not the end of the world.
That is, I do have those people like you. I mean, we probably at different times in our life had very different views on certain topics. But the other thing I like to think of is, as I've got older and I've had more life experience and I've met more people and I've traveled, probably in the last couple of years in particular, traveling in Europe this last time really gave me such a different view
Interesting.
to how, like, talking to everyday people about whatever topics, and people in Europe are just, there's so much more depth there to, like, people understanding world issues and what's happening, and you can have these discussions, and it's not always as ideologically based. It's really more about like even being in Bulgaria and looking at the history of, during the Roman times, during when Russia came in, when they were being forced by the Ottomans, and like there was this, it's just fascinating to go literally look down and see these like Roman works of, walls and you saw where people, I was watching, and my friend showed me this place where people lived in this little area between these, stone walls. And there's something about that that makes you see the world differently, and that nothing is forever. And so I wish more people could step back and say, get out of your own way, go travel, go talk to different people, and know that whatever's happening with your president, our prime minister, this too shall pass. There will be someone down the road, like they're talking now, like recently there's just crazy talk, like, oh, our unemployment is because of the war. Like, what? Like, we've seen all these problems over the last, like, it's not so
right.
Our premier just apparently recently talked about something about doing work on his Billy Bishop Airport because of what's happening in the States. Like, by the time all this work is done, Trump won't even be in the office. I mean, it's just, and that's another thing. People, politicians are, they're highly motivated sometimes to just, be strategic in wanting to tell their story and tell it their way. And I get it. I've worked in marketing. I've worked in PR. I get it that sometimes it's just a matter of we're gonna use what's happening to, and sadly, too many people just believe everything
Yeah, go
hearing.
right along.
Yeah.
Yep. But it's also not just politicians. I just got into this last week. I've been tracking the shipbuilding and
Yes.
maritime issue angle of the Iran war these last few weeks, and I was kind of getting this sense as the weeks went on that a lot of even the experts that I really respect and whose views I've come to really believe because they do their homework
Mm.
and base their views on something more than yesterday.
Yeah.
Even they started making comments that I'm sitting there thinking, I don't think that's right. And ran into one last week where a guy threw out something that I knew was totally not right. And I
Mm.
challenged him on it. And he came back with more stuff that I knew was not right.
Yeah.
And I actually wrote about that on my Substack last week. So, any of us can get ideologically hidebound and
Yeah.
then pick and choose things or choose to misconstrue. And I'm not even saying he did it willfully.
No.
You
No.
talk about it's a known fact our memories suck.
Yes.
We remember things that didn't happen
Yep.
or we remember them wrong. And I'm submitting now that even choosing our facts, we can read something and take a completely different
Oh,
thing away from it than what it's really saying because of our ideological bias.
yes.
And I think that's exactly what happened here. Um, and then what I like to also think about is, okay, if these super duper experts who truly have done their homework and know what they're talking about on almost everything else can do this, then so can I and so can anyone else.
Exactly. It's I think the difference is, and I bet you with if someone came back to you with that, you would probably go do research to say, wait a minute, and check in. That's happened to me.
For
Luckily, I
sure.
have a couple of people in my life that usually keep me on my toes if I start to get, and then I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I didn't see it that way. I get onto my, sometimes I say, okay, that's my rant for today. And then I go do more research and
Yeah.
I, right now there's some things though I do feel like, okay, I would challenge anyone if someone's going to come at me. Like I just heard this recently by someone local or a media, not local, it was a online media person saying like, Rogan doesn't have editorial standards and he's anti-vax and he's racist. And it's like, okay,
Mhm.
you tell me you have not watched a show by telling me you haven't watched a show like you.
I saw that comment on X.
Yeah. Yeah. It is, and I've seen clips. I think even one time my son pulled something and I said, go listen to the whole show. Because
Yep.
if you listen to him regularly, he is a comedian. His background is a comedian, right? So he'll say something tongue in cheek. Well, if you took that clip, right? But when you listen to the whole thing, he's actually poking fun sometimes at the whole thing, and he'll say
Mhm.
something, right? So, and there's other things I go, do not know enough about that, right? So I will not engage. Like my son recently asked me about something, and I said, Aiden, I don't know enough about that. I haven't followed that story.
Yep.
I don't know. So I can't have a discussion with you right now because I'd have to go do research. And the other thing is there's only so many things that I like to stick to things that I have
For sure.
interest in. And I will say I'm very, now that you've sort of teased us all with those clips from your book, I actually think that is going to be a really great book that I know some people that will benefit from it. And we'll have to get you out there on, if anybody listens to some podcasts, because I think in manufacturing, there isn't enough storytelling.
Yep.
One of the things when I worked in here with my board membership, as well as working in the industry, was that one of the things my clients loved about what I brought into it was the power of telling a story through the eyes of like their worker or
Yep.
a client. I always used to say, okay, if we're going to go out and promote this, give me one of your customers. I want to go talk to them. I want to tell a story. So when I've worked on videos or telling, it's like, you got to get people to tell the story. And I think it was, if you are telling a story versus just telling a fact, there's some research has been on that you're 22 times more likely to remember it if you heard it in the form of a story as opposed to just data and stats. And storytelling, I mean, it can be used for persuasion. I think what your book sounds like it will do, the persuasion part, is to show the power of manufacturing and why Americans and government needs to better understand it. That's the other thing. Most people in politics don't understand how manufacturing works. Media doesn't understand. I was one of those people. Until I got into this, I didn't understand mold making. I thought molds were, cake molds or something, or mold that you had on your, people that didn't clean their bathroom or something. And, it's when you don't have that understanding. Little sidebar, here in Canada, we had, like, they banned straws, plastic straws, plastic bags. Funny little sidebar now on the whole banning of plastic straws. So they banned plastic straws in Canada, but now we export them to the US. Make it make
Why
sense.
am I not surprised?
It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Right? So, and
one thing I would add is there are a lot of people in manufacturing who don't understand manufacturing.
That's true.
So a lot of the decisions to offshore were actually poor decisions. A buddy of mine wrote about that. And, there's these theories in finance of what makes for a good investment. And unfortunately, a group held sway back in the 80s and 90s saying that capital investment in productive assets was a net negative. Short-termerism, unfortunately, and that's
lack of
what killed us.
Lack of curiosity does so much harm if we don't ask. And
One thing I need to jump in and say before I forget about it, you mentioned how Canada is also an excellent manufacturer, and actually, in some regards, the best, because one other story that is not in my book in any way, but my dad was a lifelong forester. Worked his entire career for the U.S. Forest Service. And so he'd have his trade magazines lying around when I was a kid, and I'd read about all this stuff. Well, the coolest vehicle ever, I'm sorry, Zamboni, I think you guys are exceptionally cool, and your story will always be number one in the ones I've told. But when it comes to vehicles, I do think the coolest one out there is called a skidder, which is used to pull logs out of the forest to stage them for being transported. And I hadn't thought about those in years. And then I come across a couple of guys talking about them on LinkedIn a few months ago. And I'm like, I'm kind of curious, who makes the best skidder? And it turns out it's Tigercat Industries, also in Brantford, Ontario, like Zamboni.
Also home of Wayne Gretzky.
Yes. So
we won't get, but
we rely on more than your wood. We rely on your machines that yank the wood out of the forest.
Yes. And I think there's, just that, these conversations we've had, this is what we need more of. We need to find what we have in common, because we do have, I've even said this, manufacturing, religions, all these things. There's so many things we have more in common with. If we could just look at that instead of always these extremes. I mean, and I find extremes in everything. I cycle, but I also do my aqua, I do my Pilates, I do my yoga, because when you get into extreme of anything, like, your body will break down. If you're only doing one thing, you need to, get out and walk. You need to fresh air. You need to eat healthy. You need to do all these things if you want to be healthy and strong. The same thing applies to our government, in terms of relationships. And relationships are built on being open, having open dialogue, having communication. To shut down communication, I really wish I could get to more people in politics and say, do you think telling people not to go to the States, don't be nice to America, do you think that's going to help us? And the same thing happens in, we don't want it. Now, the one thing I'll say about what Trump has done, because I have, for anybody, I'd suggest they go read The Art of the Deal, go study it and see, you'll understand him.
I agree.
2 areas where he's been off the mark, though, is one of the points is maximize your options so you don't get painted in a corner. I don't think he did that properly. And know your market. I think he really misjudged the whole coming out against Canada, in that it's, we're kind of nice people, but I think people really were nice until, like, kind of start saying you're going to take us over. Now, I took it, I went, please, the whole 51st state. But again, if you understand the art of the deal, he's doing exactly what that book says. We should have just sidestepped it, ignored it, and focused on the 70% of Canadian experts. Like, I do not know why we just didn't say, Donald, let's talk.
Yeah.
That makes
well, and God forbid we have completely broken relations, because then we lose out on Rush and Triumph and April Wine and Bachman Turner Overdrive. More of your superb exports that are well beyond manufacturing.
We have Drake, we have The Weeknd, we have, we have lots of comedian. That's the other thing. If you look at arts and culture and film, and also I always find it it's been funny. Some of the same people that have this great dislike for the US were big on the whole Super Bowl. They watch the Super Bowl, they bet on it. I'm like, you do know we don't have any NFL teams in Canada. It's just, okay, hypocrisy is a whole other topic too that I just shake my head, because I'm like, why don't you turn it up? Don't watch the Super Bowl then. I just wish there was more, if you want to be consistent. But I also think, no, we should be supporting all of these things, because we have a lot of people from Canada go to the States, go to LA, go to New York when it comes to comedy,
for sure.
Film. So it doesn't seem very smart to now say, we're not going to be nice to Americans because of someone that is elected in it. Jim, I don't know. I do not know.
Well, I mean, it goes two ways. So you and I are doing the work to shore things up, and hopefully more people will think like we are. And
my background for events, this was for my company when I had with Gail now, was sign up, suit up, and show up, which I think is really well. And let's get curious. So that would be I think when we're reading your book, that's a perfect way to look at it. Let's get curious and read your book and learn about the backstories.
So one thing I do in my conclusion is I pull business lessons out from each company. And that's an interesting exercise, because in some regards, some of those lessons are contradictory. And, it just kind of shows the scope of manufacturing and the scope of business. I mean, something that works for one business could mean demise for another business. I think it might be interesting. Again, I chose not to include stories of companies that no longer exist, but something I've thought about is doing a follow-up book on companies whose stories I love, like Larkin Soap, or like, another one's called Laterno, one of the most successful heavy equipment manufacturers there ever was. If you want a great story, go look them up, but do a whole book of stories like that. And okay, why did these companies fail, and what can we learn from them? So I think there are some stories of companies that failed where honestly, even the best business person could not have saved them. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's someone out there who could have done things differently with every one of them, and they'd still be around. But, no company lasts forever. And I think we can learn a lot from the ones that haven't made it.
I wonder about the soap store. I wonder if they had thought about getting ahead of the curve and getting into stores before.
They actually turned the Frank Lloyd Wright headquarters building into a retail store at one time, and it just flopped.
But I wonder if they had to try to get into another store instead of creating their own. That's what I mean.
Yeah, I don't recall that. There are some very good websites on it, some really good books by a professor out of the University of Buffalo. So yeah, you can learn a lot about Larkin Soap if you want to go learn. So that's one thing I think about, but with the book I've got, I welcome your help in getting those stories out there, because I think there's a lot of good that can come out of it.
Well, I'm excited. I can't wait to read it. And just hearing the highlights today has been really intriguing, because I think for anybody, as I said, that's interested in backstories, which is what we all are into. We want to know the why, the behind. Generally, we do. We're not getting enough of that. So,
yep. Well, I have kept you for way longer than I intended, so I'm going to throw it back to you for final thoughts.
Just that I think, what we're doing today is maybe an example of what we need to see more of this interaction between Canadians and US and Canadians Americans. And, it always starts somewhere. So maybe this is something that can expand further and get people to start seeing why we need to work together as opposed to butting heads. Because if we're going to have success in manufacturing, among all the other things we talked about, and I correlate it to any relationship. If you shut down communication, that is a problem. And you're not going to move forward if you don't. As soon as you stop communicating is when you shut down, and then you can't have success.
Yeah, it's like a marriage.
Yep. Very true.
I couldn't agree more.
A lot of correlation, and it makes compromise, listening, understanding, and being open to sometimes stepping back and taking a breather and saying, what's my role in this? What's my role in where all of this went wrong? And
well, good deal.
Yeah.
Oh man, this has been phenomenal, Gail. Thank you so much for joining me on my 199th episode.
Woohoo!
And in that regard, you shared that you've got more time on your hands now. You're semi-retired, so we will absolutely have you back on. Maybe we could get a regular Gail and Jim special show every so often and revisit these topics.
Possibly
and new ones.
The background, because I do like doing the production side in the background and helping you that way too. I've done that with a few people. And
all righty. Well,
I love
give that some thought, and I'll be in touch.
Okay, sounds good.
Thanks, Gail.
Thanks.
Well, that was awesome, wasn't it? Gail brings such a refreshing perspective and just a really great thought process, and just loved all the different topics she hit on. I think some really critical ones there about kind of turning the temperature down and listening to each other. That's important both in manufacturing and in the world overall. So thank you, Gail, for joining us. And I was dead serious. We've got to have you back on regularly as you've got time on your hands. So let's work on that. For next week, show 200. And I've got a phenomenal guest again. So I've got a guy named Denny LeVay. He is an iron worker by trade. He started his own company assembling precast concrete structures that did really well. He has written a book called Blue Collar Blessed, and he's now running for U.S. Senate from Idaho. So we're going to be talking about a lot of cool stuff next week. Definitely tune in for that. We're here every week, every Tuesday. I'm Jim Vinosky, Manufacturing Talks. See ya.
Thanks for tuning in to Manufacturing Talks with Jim Vinosky. Watch for new episodes dropping every Tuesday. And don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe.